J. Robert Oppenheimer, February 18, 1967, Princeton, New Jersey. In a quiet study lined with books he would never open again, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man history remembers as the father of the atomic bomb, drew his final breath at 62 years old. The extraordinary mind that once split the atom itself collapsed under something far more ordinary, far more human than physics, a habit he simply refused to break, even as it slowly killed him. Oppenheimer smoked constantly, not casually or socially, but relentlessly, up to 5 full packs a day for decades on end, a chain of cigarettes stretching unbroken from the desert laboratories of Los Alamos to the quiet, tree-lined streets of Princeton. By 1965, the chronic cough he had waved off for years was finally, formally diagnosed as throat cancer, and there was no waving it off any longer. Doctors turned to aggressive radiation therapy, the very force Oppenheimer had once harnessed to end a devastating war and open an entirely new age of destruction. It failed him completely and quickly, offering no real relief at all. The scientist who had taught an entire world to fear invisible rays now depended on those same rays to save his own life, and they simply didn't. He slipped into a coma and never woke again. Oppenheimer's death came slowly, over agonizing years, in a warm hospital bed surrounded by grieving family members who had watched him decline. Not everyone who worked at Los Alamos would be so fortunate in how their own story ended. Some of his colleagues would meet the atom far more directly, far more violently, in sudden accidents that turned careful, controlled physics into something closer to a curse overnight. September 1945. The war was already over, but the dangerous work at Los Alamos wasn't finished yet by any means. 24-year-old physicist Harry de Holian was alone in a laboratory late at night, carefully stacking tungsten carbide bricks around a plutonium sphere the scientists had nicknamed, half-joking, the DemonCore, unaware how literal and lethal that dark joke would soon become for him personally. A single brick slipped from his hand. It fell toward the plutonium sphere below, and in a single instant, the core went supercritical, flooding the small, cramped room with a lethal, invisible pulse of radiation. Daghlian's quick instinct saved everyone else in the building that night. He swept the brick away with his own bare hand, absorbing the dose that was originally meant to spread much further. He lived 25 more agonizing days after the accident, long enough to feel his own body slowly, methodically turn against him, tissue breaking down cell by cell, internal organs failing one after another, as doctors could do nothing but helplessly watch a young man be consumed from the inside by a brand new technology barely a year old. The DemonCore, it turned out, wasn't finished with Los Alamos. 9 months later, that same plutonium sphere claimed a second, equally horrifying victim at the same facility. May 21, 1946, 35-year-old physicist Louis Slotin was performing what colleagues darkly nicknamed tickling the dragon's tail, slowly inching 2 beryllium hemispheres toward criticality using nothing more than an ordinary flathead screwdriver wedged between them as a makeshift spacer. The screwdriver slipped from his careless grip. Blue light flashed instantly across the entire room as the core snapped violently into a critical state. And Slotin, in that single blinding instant, already knew exactly what had just happened to his own body. He had absorbed a fatal dose of radiation, and no amount of medical care could possibly undo what had already been done to him in that flash. For 9 unbearable days, Slotin's body failed in agonizing slow motion in front of doctors who had genuinely never studied anything quite like it before. His hands slowly turned black, his organs shut down one after another, while physicians carefully documented every single stage of a death science barely understood. He died on May 30th, 1946, an unwilling human case study in what the atom could do to living flesh. Not every death at the heart of the bomb came from a single dramatic accident like these two. Some were far slower, buried quietly in cells altered over years by low-level exposure, only surfacing long after the war had ended, and the entire world had already moved on to a new, even more terrifying kind of weapon entirely: the hydrogen bomb, born from that same wartime research effort. It was a slower kind of killer entirely. John von Neumann calculated the precise implosion lenses that crushed the plutonium core over Nagasaki, one of the sharpest, most original minds of the entire 20th century. Fluent in mathematics, most physicists around him couldn't even begin to follow properly.
By 1957, at just 53 years old, that extraordinary mind was being slowly eaten from within by aggressive, unforgiving cancer. It started quietly in his bones and eventually spread into his brain, almost certainly seeded by radiation from the very nuclear tests he had personally helped design years earlier in his brilliant career. The disease didn't just kill him slowly. It unmade him piece by piece, dissolving the legendary precision that had defined his entire life into confusion, fear, and incoherent terror. Colleagues watched the transformation in disbelief. Von Neumann's final days played out at Walter Reed Hospital under constant armed military guard, not to protect him from any outside threat, but specifically to protect the secrets locked somewhere inside a mind no longer fully under his own control. Officers stood watch around the clock, genuinely terrified he might blurt out classified nuclear secrets while hallucinating in agonizing pain. It was a strange, sad end for such a towering mind.
Von Neumann was not alone in eventually paying for the war years with his health decades later on down the line. Enrico Fermi, the physicist who built the world's very first working nuclear reactor beneath a Chicago football stadium, had also spent years personally handling raw radioactive material with little more real protection than thin gloves and cautious, hopeful optimism. The parallels between the two men were impossible to ignore.
By 1954, at 53 years old, stomach cancer had firmly taken hold, almost certainly the delayed price of those early, poorly shielded wartime experiments he once conducted. Fermi met his own approaching death the exact same way he had met everything else in his remarkable career: analytically. From his hospital bed, he timed his own IV drips with a stopwatch, gathering data until his very last moment. Radiation exposure at Los Alamos didn't always announce itself immediately after the fact, unfortunately. Sometimes it waited patiently for decades before showing itself at all. For Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate, enthusiastic bongo player, and one of the most beloved physicists of his entire generation, it waited more than 4 full decades before finally making its move on his aging body. The delay made it worse. Feynman battled 2 rare and unusual forms of abdominal cancer simultaneously, a combination doctors strongly suspected was rooted in his years of quiet environmental exposure during the original war effort. He fought the disease for years with the same restless curiosity he always brought to physics, refusing to let the diagnosis dim his sense of humor. He died on February 15, 1988, at 69 years old. His last words to his wife weren't about physics, regret, or the terrible bomb he had helped bring into existence decades earlier in his life. They were almost a joke instead, delivered with perfect comic timing, even at the very end. "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." Somehow, even facing death itself, Feynman still couldn't resist making one final, perfectly timed punchline. Even his humor never truly left him, right to the end. Not every casualty of the Manhattan Project's culture came from radiation exposure at all, it turned out. Some paid a very different, quieter price, simply for being allowed in the room. Especially the one woman who stood quietly beside Fermi on the day humanity first ever achieved a controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction underneath a university stadium. History rarely gives such quiet sacrifices their due credit. Leona Woods was the only woman present at that historic first chain reaction, and for many long months afterward she hid a secret even more carefully guarded than the reactor itself: her own pregnancy, deliberately concealed to protect her job on a project that had, officially at least, absolutely no real place for a woman scientist at all in its ranks. Her courage in that moment is easy to overlook today. She died on November 10, 1986, at 67 years old, from cancer and pulmonary illness, almost certainly tied to her many years of pioneering, largely unprotected nuclear research work at Los Alamos. Her name is rarely remembered today alongside the famous men she worked closely beside, though her radiation exposure was every bit as real and dangerous as theirs ever was. History has been slower to credit her than it should be. Radiation wasn't the only force fully capable of killing a Manhattan Project scientist over time, as it turned out. For some of these men, it was simply the unbearable, steadily accumulating weight of the work itself, a kind of psychological pressure that could break a human body just as thoroughly and permanently as any dangerous isotope ever could manage to do. The mind, it turned out, could break just as easily as the body. Ernest Lawrence, inventor of the cyclotron and one of the project's most central architects, suffered for years from painful chronic ulcerative colitis, a condition that only intensified with every new crisis of the Cold War arms race he found himself repeatedly, exhaustingly pulled back into, year after year, with no real relief ever in sight for him. Stress, in his case, proved just as corrosive as any isotope. In 1958, during a high-tension arms control conference held in Geneva, the accumulated years of stress finally became brutally, physically real for Lawrence. His bowel ruptured suddenly in the middle of tense negotiations. He died shortly after emergency surgery at just 57 years old, a man who had, in the most literal sense possible, quite simply worked himself to death. The irony of it was lost on no one.
Not every leader of the Manhattan Project ultimately died from the science itself, though. Some of the men who commanded the project from above, rather than personally building its physics, met far more ordinary, mundane ends, though their public legacies afterward proved just as complicated and contested as any working physicist's legacy ever could. Command, it seemed, carried its own very different kind of cost. General Leslie Groves, the military commander who oversaw the entire Manhattan Project, from its budget lines all the way to its final bomb design, died on July 13, 1970, of a sudden and massive heart attack. He was 73 years old at the time of his death, and he now rests permanently in Arlington National Cemetery among the nation's countless other soldiers. A soldier's death, in the end, for a man who commanded scientists.
George Kistiowski engineered the precise explosive lenses that triggered the plutonium bomb's implosion sequence. And unlike many of his colleagues, he lived long enough to openly, publicly regret his own role in it. He spent his later years actively campaigning for global arms control, publicly and repeatedly wrestling with what his own expertise had helped make possible for all of humanity. Few reversed course so publicly. He died of cancer in 1982 at 82 years old, having spent his final decades reflecting deeply on his own legacy. His final request was strikingly specific and deliberate, that his ashes be scattered across the open Atlantic Ocean as far as physically possible from the New Mexico desert, where the very bomb he engineered was first tested in total secrecy. Even in death, he wanted distance from what he had built. Behind every physicist chasing after a bigger, more destructive weapon stood mathematicians quietly turning raw theory into concrete numbers the world could no longer safely afford to ignore any longer. Two of these brilliant mathematicians would eventually leave the Manhattan Project with strikingly different final chapters to their own personal lives. Their stories, however, would end in very different ways entirely.
Stanislaw Ulam, one of the key minds behind the hydrogen bomb's eventual final design, died suddenly of heart failure on May 13, 1984, at 75 years old. Years earlier in his life, a serious bout of brain inflammation had already permanently altered his personality, an early, unsettling warning sign of how fragile even the sharpest mind could truly turn out to be. It was a warning almost no one at the time knew how to read. Nicholas Metropolis, who pioneered using early primitive computers to calculate bomb yields with unprecedented new speed, took a much quieter path afterward through the rest of his life. He lived a long, largely uneventful existence and died of natural causes in Los Alamos on October 17, 1999, at 83, one of the rare few simply allowed to peacefully grow old. In a project full of tragedy, his ending was almost unremarkable. For every single scientist consumed early by cancer or sudden catastrophe on this list, another lived on for decades afterward instead, carrying the immense weight of the bomb in very different ways, some in quiet, private denial, others in loud, very public reckoning with exactly what they had helped unleash on the entire world. Regret, it seemed, was never evenly distributed among them. Very few of them found peace with it. Edward Teller, the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb, outlived nearly every single colleague who had once stood beside him at Los Alamos during the war years. While younger physicists died of radiation-linked cancers in their 50s and 60s, Teller lived all the way to 95 years old, dying of a stroke in 2003, seemingly completely untouched by any regret. History would remember him very differently than most of his peers. Philip Morrison had physically assembled the very core of the Trinity test himself, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon anywhere on Earth in human history. What he personally witnessed afterward in Japan changed him permanently and completely, and he spent the rest of his long life as a passionate, outspoken advocate for global nuclear disarmament efforts. He died peacefully in his sleep in 2005. at 89 years old. One final name on this entire list never wore his Los Alamos badge with full, genuine loyalty, unlike all the others. Klaus Fuchs worked alongside these brilliant men every single day for years, fully trusted by all of them, all while secretly passing America's most closely guarded nuclear secrets straight to the Soviet Union, without anyone around him suspecting a thing for years. His loyalty, it turned out, belonged to a very different country. Fuchs was eventually caught, formally imprisoned, and later lived out the remainder of his life quietly in East Berlin, dying of natural causes on January 28, 1988, at 76 years old. Unlike so many of the brilliant men he had worked closely beside and ultimately betrayed, Klaus Fuchs lived long enough to actually watch the Cold War he helped ignite finally begin, slowly, to end at last.